Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've had an opportunity to listen closely to my friend, Senator Kaine, who asked the important question about voting rights, about when are we going to act? And that is a question. That is something that each of us, need to ask ourselves, is when. But I think we also need to keep in mind the how we act, because I think how we act is important. Because I think we recognize when we act unilaterally as a party on issues that are of great weight and great political debate in this country, that solutions to these difficult problems come best when we are able to be working together. And I know that we are very fractured in this body, and it has made it hard. But hard does not mean it is impossible. It's only impossible if we give up and we say it can't be done. To my friend from Montana, and I appreciate the common sense words of a man of the earth, a good farmer. Amen to what you said about this body and our dysfunctionality. We are not the same Senate that I came to close to 20 years ago. I beat you by about 5 years, 6 years. We're not that same body. We are not operating in the manner with which I think we really were designed to be. That tempering body, that deliberative body. We're supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, and we don't demonstrate that on any single day out there. But I question whether or not changing the rules actually works to change the attitude, because that's what I think we've got going on here. The rules have been in place for a long while. It's just how we have chosen to utilize them to our advantage and to the disadvantage of the other side. And that's unfortunate. And I don't know how. It's much easier, I think, to change the rules than it is to change attitude. It is much easier to try to do things alone than to try to build consensus. Just ask any one of the 10 of us that worked tirelessly last year to advance a bipartisan infrastructure bill. There were so many points along the way where any one of us or any half of the group could have said, we're done, this is just too hard, we're never going to make progress. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. The senator from Montana urged us all to read this measure before us, the Freedom to Vote, the John R. Lewis Act, now pending before the Senate. It is a few new things that have been added in, but much of it is what we saw previously with the Freedom to Vote Act. I voted against that motion for cloture when it came before us because I looked at that as being a bill that was overly prescriptive. In my view, it really did work towards nationalizing elections. I come from a state where things are just a little bit different there. You hear me talk about it all the time. Part of it is dictated by the geography. Part of it is dictated by an indigenous population where the language that is on the ballot doesn't align with what they speak at home and how we address matters like that. What has happened with this measure in front of us is it has been combined with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which I have worked on in good faith with good colleagues who I respect enormously. And I appreciate that we've been able to sit down. In fairness, much of the good work goes to our respective staffs who sat down and said, all right, can we do a little bit over here? What do we need to do over here? And we've made some progress. We made enough progress that I was certainly willing to vote to advance debate here on the Senate floor on that measure. I recognize that not everybody sees the value and the benefits of preclearance. I recognize what the courts did in Shelby. But I also heard, as Senator Kaine said, the courts saying, all right, legislative branch, do something about it now. And so I've been willing to be part of that discussion, not only this Congress, but in previous Congresses where I've joined with Chairman Leahy to try to advance that conversation. We haven't been as successful as I would have liked, but I certainly think we made good progress with the John Lewis voting rights bill. We had a substitute. As I look through this bill, it looks like much of that substitute has been incorporated, including the Native American Voting Rights Act, which I've worked hard on in the Indian Affairs Committee with Chairman Schatz to try to make that as robust as we possibly can. And I've done all this because I do believe that this Senate should pass a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. But I also believe that it must be a bipartisan effort. It has been 16 years since we last addressed the Voting Rights Act. We need to do more than just talk about it. We need to ensure that the ballot is equal for all Americans and free from any discrimination. It's pretty simple for me in that regard. And that wherever you've got uncertainty, wherever you have ambiguity in the laws that govern our federal elections, we need to clarify these. We need to clarify these so that there aren't these open questions or perhaps cynical interpretations that would go with them. And so how do you do it? Because this is all hard stuff. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that. You really do have to do it coming together to try to hear the objections. And as I look at the measure that we have before us, I'm not convinced that we're there yet. I'm not convinced that we're there yet with the product that we have. I will absolutely agree that there are some good, I think there's some important provisions in the matters that we have in front of us. But what we're faced with today or later today is going to be a take it or leave it vote, and then an effort to change how we approach hard issues. Before I get into my comments in that vein, I do want to look and highlight what I think are some of the positives that we have in place, because I think of a collaborative effort, but because we've got shared observations, we've got shared views on what some of these solutions may be, and I think that these can help us in anchoring a more broadly supported bill. The measure features transparency provisions that require public notice of changes to state voting rules for federal elections. I think we're all say, yeah, this is important, this is common sense. Changes to electoral district boundaries for elections at all levels. Information about precincts and polling places for federal elections. These are things that I think there's consensus here. We've got stronger protections, necessary protections for voters during registration and voting, as well as protections for election workers, polling places, election infrastructure. The measure emphasizes the security of voting systems. I think we recognize, again, this is imperative. It has to be a priority. If we're going to thwart any malign actors out there, maintain confidence in election results, we have to have this. Important to me, it extends the bilingual election requirements of the Voting Rights Act for 5 years. It also includes the Native American Voting Rights Act, again, that we worked on in the Indian Affairs Committee to address, unfortunately, very long-standing obstacles to voting for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So there's good stuff, if you will, good measures that are contained within the bill in front of us. But they also have some negatives, and I think you've heard my colleagues detail many of them. Not only negatives within the text, but in terms of this partisan effort that we have in front of us. We've got a measure that's 753 pages long. We can move through that. We're not going to say just because it's big doesn't mean that we can't do it again. But it has come over to us as through a shell vehicle. It's now directly on the legislative calendar. You've got, again, this combination of two bills plus a few add-ons. But unfortunately, neither of these, even with my support on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, neither one of these had sufficient support to pass cloture. And since then, we haven't done anything, I shouldn't say anything, because there were a few additional provisions that were included. I don't want to dismiss that, but not much has been done to build support cooperatively in this body for the two combined measures, other than to build pressure to not change the legislation, not to modify it, not to gain compromise, but to change the rules to take it up. This is a big bill, but one of the things that we don't have contained in it that many of us have been talking about now for a period of time is we don't address the Electoral Count Act, which I think most of us would look at this and say, this is something that needs to be revised. We do not need a repeat of 2020 when, by all accounts, our last president, having lost the election, sought to change the results of that election by demanding that his vice president exploit vague statutory language that was written decades ago. We need to address this. The bill before us has some gaps, but at the same time that it has gaps, it's also pretty prescriptive in many areas. Some of the previous objections that I had made to the Freedom to Vote Act remains. I share with my colleagues, I want us to protect voting rights. I think we should all want to protect voting rights. But my concern that as we look at this measure is that it's going to make any kind of a change that states would make to their election laws for any reason extremely difficult to do without being directly challenged in court. And maybe that's the goal here, but what it does do, in my view, is deprive states of the flexibility to design and implement their own laws as the Constitution provides. And again, I look to my state for some of those very specific examples where if I have a small remote village with perhaps 100 voters, and I have a prescription in federal law that says a polling place must be open and available for a period of a week to 10 days with 2 weekends. If you're out in a village and you're living a subsistence lifestyle, Saturday and Sunday don't mean anything to you. It's when are the animals moving? When are the fish moving? Let's not put limits on our states so that they can't enhance opportunities for all voters. So federalization is not the right answer here. And again, whether we're talking voting rights or other issues, typically in my state, a one-size-fits-all approach is not the right effort. So we've got to find an appropriate balance that doesn't result in a takeover of states' ability to run their own elections, and how we are able to achieve that balance is important. So as I talk about my views on the legislation that we have before us, I'm very, very well aware that the results of this effort to push voting rights was unfortunately determined before we began this debate. We're going to come to a vote on a motion to invoke cloture. We know what's going to happen. It's going to fail due to a lack of sufficient support. And then we're going to face some kind of a vote to change the Senate's rules and weaken the legislative filibuster, which we also understand will fail. And I guess the point here is to get folks on record. And that will happen. But what have we accomplished? What have we accomplished for the people that we serve, instead of allowing us as a body to say, okay, what are we going to do to address this? We have brought cross-party relationships to yet another low, perhaps an unprecedented low. I was part of a very troubling conversation last evening, and it was shared that, depending on which side you're on in this body today on this issue, you're either a racist or a hypocrite. Really? Really, is that where we are? I find that so hard and so troubling, because when it becomes that deep and that divided, where we cannot have the debate that my friend from Montana says we need, and I agree we need. But if we are so divided, this is not right. This is not good for the health of the body. But what has happened here is we have devolved into a debate over voting rights versus voting rules. And you got part of the country that thinks this bill is about protecting the right to vote. Another part believes that this bill will do nothing but undermine it. And so we're both sitting in a situation, I think, where both sides are now set to cast doubt on elections if they don't win. And that takes us to a very troubling place, Mr. President. Because when people doubt whether their vote matters, when they doubt whether that individual who is sitting in the White House was freely and fairly elected, they will doubt all decisions. They will doubt what we do here, and they will doubt their own democracy. And that is troubling for our nation. So I refuse to believe that this is the best that we can do right now. As I said, this is hard, but hard is not impossible. I think that we can, if we are operating in good faith, as there are so many in this body who do that on a daily basis. It doesn't get noted because, quite honestly, it's far more interesting to write about the fur that flies around here rather than us actually making things happen together. But the effort to change our rules, to pass legislation on a party line basis is not going to help us here. It's not going to help us here. I think that we need to do everything that we possibly can to avoid further polarizing voting rights and election reforms. It may be too late. I don't know. It may be just too late, but I think we have to try. I think that we have to try. And I think that there is an effort to try to do just that. There's a good handful of people in this body on both sides of the aisle that have been talking this through, kind of following the model of what we did with the bipartisan infrastructure group. When we first started that effort, nobody believed that we would be successful with that probably most listening to the debate that's going on now and will go on later all throughout the afternoon don't believe that we can do anything, but let's prove them wrong. Let's prove them wrong. Let's sit down with those who have made that commitment. We've heard it here on the floor, made that commitment to work through some of these issues, some of these areas of common ground that I think we can build a base from, and work to build a foundation that will be enduring for this country when it comes to election reform and voting rights. Because, Mr. President, I fear greatly that if we are to advance measures that are solely, strictly party line, and that's what eliminating the legislative filibuster will allow us to do, we will take the easy way out. Senator Tester suggested that maybe we're getting a little legislatively lazy around here. We will get even lazier because we don't have to do the hard work of trying to find consensus. Elections and voting rights are so important. We understand that. Let's commit to resolving the issues that divide us, that will not only help bring this Congress closer together, but that just possibly, just hopefully, and maybe I too am naive, Senator Kaine, but that just possibly can help heal this country, because that's what we need right now. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.